I ended up in this building because my life was on kind of a weird clock, and this was one of the only places that would take me without a long waiting list or 6 months of pay stubs. I'm not going to get into why I needed somewhere fast. It's not really the point here. It's one of those mixed-use setups you see in older parts of the city. Shops at street level, apartments stacked on top. You've probably walked past 10 buildings just like it, without ever wondering who lives there. On my block, there's a laundromat on one side, a small pharmacy on the other, and in the middle there's this dead cafe with the old sign, still hanging crooked over papered-up windows. The landlord told me it used to be a big deal around here, which I'm sure he said to every tenant for the last decade. You get to the apartments by way of an outdoor metal staircase that always sounds like it's 2 seconds from collapsing, but apparently has been sounding like that for years. My place is on the first landing, facing the side street instead of the main road. In theory, that meant less traffic noise and fewer drunk people screaming at 2 in the morning, which was a selling point for me. There's a door directly across from mine that belongs to the unit on my level, and then 2 more doors up on the top landing that you only notice if you look up and really pay attention. The 5th apartment is tucked behind the old cafe with its own entrance, so most of the time it feels like there are maybe 3 of us total, even though technically there are more. It's the kind of layout that makes it very easy to live in your own little bubble. The first person I met here was the guy across from me. I was hauling this ridiculously heavy box up the rattly stairs on move-in day, trying not to drop my entire kitchen onto the sidewalk, when his door opened and he stepped out holding a chipped mug. He said his name was Hale, just Hale, and yes, that's really how he introduced himself. I still don't know if it's a first name or a last name situation, but that's what everyone calls him, including the landlord. He looked like he was somewhere in that late 40s, early 50s zone, where people either start running marathons or just get very into fixing things. He had on this permanent uniform of faded sweater and worn jeans, and he gave off this, "I kind of run this place, but it's not official, so don't quote me" type of energy. He nodded at my door, asked if that was me moving in, and without really waiting for an answer, started giving me the rundown. He started talking about the internet before I'd even mentioned wanting Wi-Fi. According to him, old plaster like this eats signals for breakfast, so he told me where to put my router for the best coverage and tossed in a comment about not trusting cloud backups anyway. At the time, I just smiled and thought, okay, that's my overshares about wiring neighbor. The second neighbor I met was Evan. He lives on my level too, but in the unit that shares a wall with the closed cafe, so his door is technically around the corner from Hale's, even though we're all sharing the same landing. The first time I saw him, he came up the stairs behind me, while I was stuck in that awkward position of having a box in both hands and no free fingers for the keys. He looked to be around my age. He offered to grab one of the boxes and without making a big deal about it, which I appreciated. He said he'd been there about a year, called the place cheap and loud but survivable. We started out as typical hallway acquaintances. We'd pass each other on the stairs or in the laundry nook and do the usual comments about work, weather, and how the laundromat downstairs always seemed to be open, but never actually had anyone in it. Hale floated in and out of those interactions too. He was always around, not in a jump scare way, just in a "how are you everywhere" kind of way. There were moments where something about his questions made me file them away in the back of my mind. Like the time he mentioned from nowhere that my balcony probably gets good evening light, and then followed it up by saying he could see it from his kitchen window. He said it like a compliment, but it landed a little strange. Evan, on the other hand, felt easy in that way where you don't have to constantly manage the conversation. We texted a little after I'd been there a month. Stuff like, "Is your power flickering too?" Or, "Do you know if there's any decent food open past midnight around here?" And eventually that turned into him coming over to help fix my TV sound when it started cutting out. At least that's how it started. He sat on my floor in front of the TV, pretending to know more than he probably did about HDMI ports, and we ended up watching some movie halfway through and making fun of it. He'd knock on my door after work some nights. We'd eat whatever cheap takeout we could agree on, and he'd stay over sometimes. He was nice, attentive in that way, where he actually listened when I complained about my job. And he'd do small things like remember how I take my coffee. Nothing mind-blowing, but very comfortable. When things became physical, it felt normal. I wasn't in love or anything, but I liked him. It was low maintenance and, as far as I could tell, harmless. Because of that, I didn't think too hard about the other weirdness at first. Little tech things mostly. My cheap Bluetooth speaker would crackle and spit out a second of static when it was off. My phone would drop calls inside the apartment and be fine as soon as I stepped onto the landing. The smart assistant, a friend had given me as a housewarming present, would light up in the middle of the night like it had heard its wake word. Stuff you can chalk up to bad wiring in old buildings if you want to. Meanwhile, Hale kept doing his rounds. He'd knock sometimes to say the landlord was having work done on the pipes and to expect the water off for an hour, or to mention he'd reset the main modem in the basement. If anyone's internet had been slow, I hadn't even known there was a shared setup like that until he told me. He also liked to drop casual comments that made it clear he paid attention to everyone's routines. The first time I really noticed something was off was one night when Evan and I were arguing about something stupid in my living room. Mid-argument, the smart speaker in the corner lit up and repeated a single word one of us had just said, then went dead again. We both laughed it off, made some joke about it, taking sides, and moved on. Then there were the echoes. I'd be on a call with my sister or my mom, walking around my apartment, and there'd be this split-second delay where I could hear my own voice feeding back faintly, like it was looping through something else before getting to them. It only ever happened when I was home. If I stepped outside or went to the cafe 2 blocks down, calls were normal. It was creepy, but in a way that's easy to write off as my service sucks here. So that's what I did. The turning point for me didn't come from a jump scare or some horror movie reveal. It came on a Tuesday night when Evan fell asleep on my couch with a podcast droning from his phone. I was putting away dishes in the kitchen, listening to the muffled voice, and then the audio just cut. There was a second or two of silence, then my own voice played from the speaker. It was me on the phone, complaining about a rough day at work. I recognized the conversation, right down to the dumb joke I'd made about quitting and becoming a barista. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then the podcast resumed like nothing had happened. Evan didn't even twitch. I stood there with a dish towel in my hand, staring at his phone like it had grown teeth. Later, when he sort of jerked awake and said he was going to crash at his own place, he left his phone on the coffee table by mistake. I called his name, but he was already halfway up the stairs and didn't hear me. I know I should have just grabbed it and gone after him. Instead, I picked it up and unlocked it. I told myself I was only looking to see what app had glitched so badly. It started playing my life back at me. But I went straight to his files. Buried in his audio folder was a list of clips, with names that meant nothing to me but dates and times that did. When I tapped one, I heard myself again. Not all of them were me. Some were snatches of the upstairs tenants. Some were the landlord yelling at someone on the phone in the hallway. A few had this faint background whirring noise, like they'd been recorded near a vent or a fan. I backed out of the folder and went looking for anything that explained why. That's when I found the messages. There was a thread pinned to the top of his texts, with no name attached, just a number. When I opened it, it wasn't photos, it was links to audio clips. Every few messages, the other person would reply with, "Good." Leave it there. My stomach dropped. I scrolled up and saw that the thread went back basically to when I'd moved in. I took my own phone out and started taking pictures of his screen. Every part of that thread I could fit in. I didn't wake him up right then. I slipped his phone into my hoodie pocket, walked out onto the landing, and knocked on his door. He opened it in a t-shirt and sweatpants, eyes still bleary. I handed him his phone, Told him he'd left it and went back to my side without saying anything else because I knew if I started, it was all going to spill out in a way I wasn't ready for. I locked my door, sat on the floor, and went through the screenshots until I couldn't look at them anymore. It took a few days and a lot of internal arguments before I worked up the nerve to go to the police. I told them everything I could. The weird tech stuff, the shared modem in the basement. They asked if I knew who the number belonged to. I said I didn't, but that whoever it was seemed very interested in my schedule and everyone's conversations. From there, it all moved in that slow, disjointed way, where you only get fragments unless you're in every room at once. Eventually, one of the detectives sat me down and asked me to confirm Hale's number off an old text the landlord had put in a group chat about water shutoffs. It matched the unsaved one in Evan's phone. I found out later what they'd actually uncovered. Hale had set up little listening points around the building, cheap mics tucked into things nobody looks at twice, all wired, or connected back through the building's existing lines into the basement, where he'd tied them into his own equipment. Evan's job was simple: hang out with people, note when they were home, and send him feedback on what was working. He was tuning my life like a radio station. He had hours of people's everyday noise recorded for no reason, other than that he could. There were charges, like you'd expect: invasion of privacy, illegal interception of communications, a bunch of phrases you never want associated with where you sleep. I stayed for a little while after that, because you can't always flip your life overnight, no matter how contaminated a place feels. But it never went back to normal. Every LED on my router looked like an eye. Every small hole in the wall looked like it could be hiding a microphone. I moved out a few months later. I told people it was because I wanted to be closer to work and in a building with better insulation, which sounded a lot saner than, "I can't sit in my living room without wondering who's listening." My dad doesn't like talking about this night. I've brought it up a couple of times as an adult, and he'll shrug and say he doesn't really remember. But I know he does. I was about 6 or 7 when it happened. There are a lot of things I only have bits and pieces of, and a lot of ifs and buts when you try to put it together now, but I'm sure about what I'm telling. We were living in a rough neighborhood back then. Not the kind of place you move into by choice if you have a lot of options. People yelled in the street. There were fights on the sidewalk, and loud bangs at night weren't unusual. You got used to hearing sirens. You got used to seeing the same faces outside every day. Some of them you waved to, some you pretended not to see. This happened on one of the big celebration nights. I honestly couldn't tell you which one. It might have been the 4th of July. It might have been New Year's. It might have been some game everyone on the block was watching. I just remember the flashes of light coming through my bedroom curtains and the constant popping outside that sounded like the sky was falling apart. On nights like that, people confuse fireworks and gunshots all the time, and police get flooded with calls they have to sort through. That night, it was my dad at home with us. My mom had been sick earlier and took something that knocked her out. My brother and sister were already asleep. I was the only one still awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to count how many pops were actually outside and how many were on the TV in the living room. Sometime after midnight, someone started knocking on our front door. My dad muted the TV and listened. The knocking kept going. A steady rhythm, not pounding, but not gentle either. He called out and asked who it was. There was no answer. He checked the peephole and didn't see anybody standing there. With all the noise going on outside, it could have been somebody drunk or hitting the wrong house. But on that block, you don't assume anything. Because of how long that first round of knocking went on, and because he wasn't tired enough to ignore it, my dad left the couch and came down the hall. My mom was out cold. My brother and sister were dead asleep. I was still awake, so he stepped into my room for a second, told me to stay in bed and not get up if I heard anything weird, then went back to the living room. I waited a minute and then did what kids do anyway. I climbed out of bed, and padded down the hall to where he was. He was sitting on the edge of the couch with the TV muted, staring at the front door. I sat down next to him without saying anything. He put his arm around me and kept his eyes on the door. He told me quietly that if anyone knocked again, I was not to move, no matter what they said. Even with people yelling outside, even with fireworks going off. When the knocking started up again, it sounded different. It was softer, like whoever was doing it had their face right up against the wood and didn't want the rest of the street to hear. After a few of those slow, spaced-out knocks, my dad stood up. He told me to lie down on the floor by the couch and stay there. Then he went to his bedroom and opened the closet and came back with a gun I didn't even know existed. It was a handgun he kept locked away. Licensed and legal, just not something you talk about with small kids. He turned the TV off, shut off the light, and sat in the dark where he could see both the front door and the doorway to the kitchen. The next sounds weren't at the front anymore. Something jiggled the back door handle, just enough to rattle the frame. A moment later, there was a scraping sound at the kitchen window, metal on wood, like someone was testing it. Out on the street, blasts kept going off, and people kept cheering. Inside the house, it was so quiet I could hear my dad's breathing above me and the faint hum of the refrigerator. What happened after that? I know partly from what I saw and partly from what my parents filled in later. The back door hinges gave the smallest creak, the kind you only notice when you're waiting for it. My dad shouted once, loud enough that it made my whole body tense. The door kept moving. There were 2 sharp cracks, one right after the other. They were louder than the TV ever was, but in my head at the time they just blended in, with everything else exploding outside. The police didn't show up right away. My dad called 911 and told them someone had come into the house and that he'd fired the gun. They were already dealing with a lot that night. Reports of shots that turned out to be fireworks, and fireworks people thought were shots. It took some time before a cruiser pulled up and officers came to the door. They had him put the gun down, checked on my mom, and then made us stay in the back bedrooms while they cleared the house. When they started talking to my parents, they told them what they'd found. Outside, there were muddy footprints coming up from the alley to our back steps. There were pry marks on the window frame over the sink, where someone had tried to force it open and given up. Inside, on the floor near the back door, and in the hallway, they found a roll of duct tape and a pack of heavy zip ties that didn't belong to us. Officer told my dad straight that if he'd opened the front door just to see why someone was knocking, or if he hadn't had the gun when the back door started to open, that night could have gone very differently. On a regular quiet weeknight, neighbors might have heard the yelling and done something or at least called sooner. On that night, with fireworks going off and music blaring, it all just folded into the background. We didn't stay in that house much longer after that. My parents said it was for a better school, and because they were tired of all the noise and trouble on that street, and that was part of it. But once someone has been in your kitchen with duct tape and zip ties in their pocket while your kids are asleep in the next room, it never really feels like your house again, no matter how many locks you change. My dad never came right out and said who he thought it was, but I've always had my own guess. There was a guy, 2 doors down, he constantly had issues with. They'd argued in the street more than once. He was the type who always seemed to be standing at his window, just watching the block. He knew when my dad's truck was gone and when it was back. Even on a night when the whole neighborhood was loud and lit up, he would have heard those knocks and those shots clearer than anyone. He never mentioned hearing a thing. I moved into my current place about a year ago. It's an older duplex on a pretty average street. Nothing special, but the rent was good, and it was closer to my job than where I was before. There are only 3 units in the building technically. I have the whole upstairs. There's a small studio in the back on the ground floor with its own entrance, and the main ground floor unit is right under me. That one was already taken when I moved in. The landlord told me the guy downstairs was quiet, keeps to himself, which honestly sounded perfect at the time. The first time I met him was a few days after I moved in. I was still tripping over unopened boxes and getting used to how the floors creak at some spots. I heard someone coming up the shared stairs and opened my door, thinking it was the landlord. Instead, there was this man in his late 40s maybe, holding a grocery bag and balancing a bunch of mail. He had that tired office look, button down and slacks, but not quite the corporate type. He smiled a little, said he lived downstairs, introduced himself as Eric, and apologized right away if I ever heard odd hours from his place, because he worked nights. I told him it was fine. I was just glad not to be over a loud family anymore. Nothing about that conversation felt strange. For the first couple of months, he was exactly what the landlord had said. I'd hear his door open and close, sometimes very late, sometimes mid-morning, but never anything more than that. No loud music, no arguments, no visitors that I noticed. If I happened to be coming in or out when he was at the mailbox, he'd say hi and ask how the apartment was treating me, then go right back inside. I never saw him hanging around outside or talking to the neighbor next door. He was just sort of there, like part of the building. There's a shared stairwell that only we use. You go in the front door, there's a tiny landing, his door on the right, and the stairs up to mine directly in front. The other ground floor studio has a separate side entrance, so whoever lives there almost never comes through the front. If I'm honest, most of the time it just felt like it was me and Eric stacked on top of each other in this old house. I didn't think much about what he did at night beyond what he told me. Whenever I heard a TV through the floor or the faint sound of voices, I assumed he was unwinding after whatever weird shift he had. After a while, I started to notice a pattern that I only picked up on because my schedule changed. I went from regular hours to this rotating shift at work, which meant some weeks I was still up around midnight or one even on weekdays. On those nights, at almost the same time, I'd hear the exact same little burst of noise from below me. It was short, maybe a minute or two, and always sounded like a TV show. Laugh track, some talking, more laughing, then it would cut off. At first, I thought he was just falling asleep with the TV on, and it went to some menu, but it was too consistent. Same kind of sound, and almost the same time every night. Eventually, I got used to it, being this strange little nightly mark. If I was at my desk and heard it, I'd look at the time and it would always be around the same point. Give or take a couple of minutes. It didn't bother me enough to ask about it. It was just noticeable. What did stand out more was that, aside from those little bursts, I never really heard him move around. No vacuum, no dishes, no shower running at obvious times. You'd think living on top of someone, you'd hear at least a few everyday sounds. The first time I smelled anything was on a weeknight when I got home late. It was probably around 11. I opened the front door of the building and got hit with this sharp chemical smell in the stairwell. It reminded me of those strong cleaning products maintenance people use in public bathrooms or something like that. I figured maybe the landlord had sent someone to scrub the halls, or there had been some plumbing issue. It faded by the time I got to the top of the stairs. Over the next couple of weeks, it kept happening, though not every night. Just sometimes I'd come in or go out late, and the air in that tiny entrance would have that same sting to it, like something chemical hanging low. Every time I went upstairs, it got weaker, and once I closed my door, it basically went away. That's what made me think it was coming from behind Eric's door or whatever was beyond it. The back studio doesn't connect to that stairwell at all, and there aren't any other units tied into that wall. It was really just us. I finally decided I'd say something small about it if I caught him one of those nights. I'm not the type to make a big deal out of smells or noise, but it was getting strong enough that it bothered my throat going up and down the stairs. One night I heard his door open below while I was in my hallway. I stepped out and leaned over the banister. He was standing there in the entrance, jacket half on like he'd just come in or was about to leave, and I said hi and made some casual comment. He looked up at me for a second longer than usual before answering, then said something about just using some heavy-duty cleaner in the kitchen, and that he'd try to go easy on it. I said no worries. I was just curious, and went back inside. After that talk, the smell didn't really go away. If anything, I started noticing it more, but only at specific times, and only right around his door and that little landing. The night everything clicked was a Wednesday. I remember because I had an early shift the next morning and was annoyed I couldn't fall asleep. It was a little after midnight and I was still awake, lying there staring at my ceiling. Right on schedule, the usual bit of TV laughter and chatter came through the floor. A few minutes later, I started to hear a low humming sound under that same patch of floor. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like some kind of machine starting up. At the same time, that same chemical smell began to creep into my room. It wasn't like the whole building reeked. If I'd been asleep with the door closed, I'm not sure it would have woken me. But with my door open to the hallway, and my bed sitting almost right over where his living room would be, I could feel it building. I lay there for a bit trying to tell myself it was just some deep cleaning thing or laundry or whatever. But the longer the hum went on, the more my brain fixated on how strange the combination was. I decided I'd at least check if something obvious was happening, like a leak or a spill. I got out of bed, put on a hoodie over my t-shirt and some old shoes, and stepped into my hallway. The smell was stronger out there, drifting up the stairs. I walked down slowly, partly because it was late and I didn't want to sound like I was stomping around, partly because I was suddenly hyper-aware of every creak. When I reached the bottom, I saw that Eric's door wasn't all the way closed. It was resting against something on the floor, his shoe wedged in the gap. From inside his place, I could hear a TV going, but it was off somehow. It wasn't the usual show sound. It was more like a loop you hear in the background. Same type of laughter repeating, glasses clinking, voices that didn't quite match up. The hum was louder down there too, deeper, coming from somewhere behind the living room. I knocked lightly on the door frame and called his name once. Nothing. I pushed the door a little and squeezed by the shoe. The living room was lit by the TV and one lamp. It was surprisingly bare for someone who'd lived there longer than me. At the far side of the room, there was a narrow hallway I'd never seen before. You couldn't tell it was there from outside. The windows in the front only showed the living room. Down that hallway, there was a faint light coming from somewhere deeper in the unit. Not bright, more like whatever was behind that door. Didn't have a full fixture on. The hum and the smell were both stronger in that direction. I stood there for a few seconds, just inside his living room, trying to decide if I had any right to go farther. It felt wrong to be in there at all, but it also felt wrong to ignore the fact that something mechanical and chemical was going on below my bedroom. I ended up moving down the hallway anyway, one slow step at a time, listening for any other sound besides the hum and the canned crowd noise from the TV. There was only one door at the end of the hall, on the left side. A thin stripe of light showed under it, and as I got closer, I could see a shadow now and then pass over that stripe, like someone was shifting their weight inside or walking by. I didn't hear talking, no music, just that low machine noise and those occasional movements. I stopped before I reached the door itself. I wasn't about to try the handle or put my ear right up against it. Standing there was enough to make my stomach clench. Everything about the situation felt off. The propped front door, the fake TV sound left running, the smell that had been leaking into the stairwell for weeks, all leading to this one closed door with a machine running behind it. I realized that all those nights I'd heard the little TV burst and then nothing else. It might have been the same trick. That was as far as I got. Some instinct finally cut through the curiosity and told me that if whoever was in there opened that door and found me standing in their hallway, there would be no good way to explain myself. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the floor instead of the light, and retraced my steps to the living room. The hum stayed steady. The TV kept playing its fake bar noise. When I reached the front door, I moved the shoe just enough to slip out then nudged it back with my foot so it looked the way it had when I came in. I went upstairs as quietly as I could, closed my own door, and sat down on the edge of my bed, trying to steady my breathing. The smell was still there, but already less intense now that I'd shut myself in. I thought about calling the landlord or the non-emergency police line, but I kept getting stuck on what I would even say, and it would be obvious who had complained. I ended up just lying back down, fully dressed, and listening. At some point, the hum stopped. The TV noise clicked off not long after. The next day, I checked the parking area from my window before work. Eric's car spot was empty. That wasn't unheard of. Sometimes he was gone during the day. It just stood out after the night I'd had. I went out into the stairwell and sniffed the air without really meaning to. No chemical smell, just dust and the faint cleaner the landlord used once a month. His door was closed this time. If I hadn't gone down there, it would have looked like any other morning. By the end of that week, his car hadn't come back once. The blinds in his front window stayed in the same position. No lights on at night. No little burst of TV sound at midnight. It was like someone had cut that whole unit out of the building. After a while, envelopes started piling up by his door. At first, it was just mail the landlord must have pushed through the slot. No one picked them up. Months have passed now. The landlord eventually put a notice on Eric's door about unpaid rent and legal stuff. A while after that, I came home to find a couple of strangers going in and out, with trash bags and boxes, cleaning the place out. The door to that back room was open for the first time since I'd seen it. But from the angle of the front window, I couldn't see much beyond a bare floor and part of a wall. I thought about accidentally going down there while they were working, but I didn't. I just watched from my own doorway. I still don't know what was actually going on in that room. For all I know, it could have been something boring and technical that happened to smell awful and needed sound cover, and I just walked into it at the wrong moment. But the way that door at the end of the hallway glowed under the frame with somebody's shadow moving behind it tells a different story.